The Galactic Survey Corps had a saying, though calling it a saying was generous. It was more of a smug observation repeated at symposiums by researchers who enjoyed the smell of their own intellectual superiority. Any species that masters faster-than-light travel has already conquered their own world. Which was technically true, in the way that saying water is wet is true, accurate, but monumentally unhelpful when you're drowning. What the saying failed to account for was this: conquering a world and surviving in one were entirely different skill sets, and the gap between them could swallow entire expeditions whole. The Corps prided itself on psychological endurance ratings, a bureaucratic masterpiece that reduced the infinite complexity of sentient minds to a tidy numerical scale. The Vrin, with their crystalline logic matrices, scored a comfortable 8.7. The Cathari, those methodical amphibious scholars, pulled a respectable 8.3. Even the high-strung Zelthi managed a 7.9, though everyone suspected some creative accounting in that assessment. These ratings predicted how long a species could maintain operational coherence in hostile, unpredictable environments before their collective sanity started developing cracks. The ratings had been developed after the incident on Morton 4, which nobody discussed at parties anymore because it involved a decorated Vrin commander attempting to negotiate a peace treaty with a particularly aggressive fern. Posthumous therapy reviews suggested that 17 days without recognizable patterns had essentially factory reset his cognition. The Corps responded with what large organizations always respond with: more paperwork and a rating system. Humans, those bizarre little primates from that wet rock in the unfashionable end of the Orion Spur, had a psychological endurance rating of 6.2. The rating board had debated going lower but decided that seemed unkind. After all, humans had only achieved interstellar flight 40 years ago, after discovering a dormant jump gate in their own asteroid belt, which was either extraordinary luck or the universe having a laugh at everyone's expense. Probably both. The number 6.2 implied fragility, delicacy, a species that needed their hands held through the scary parts of the cosmos. It was the kind of rating that made senior researchers pat humans on the head, metaphorically speaking, and assign them to desk work where they couldn't hurt themselves or complicate anything important. Which made it monumentally ironic that Expedition 47 Vadara was about to prove every single assumption behind that number catastrophically wrong. Vadara 7 sat in the Goldilocks zone of its star like a jewel in a case nobody wanted to open. Its file read like a nature documentary written by someone with a grudge: 93% jungle coverage, atmospheric humidity that made breathing feel like drinking, and a biodiversity index that made xenobotanists weep with either joy or terror depending on their medication levels. The planet had no axial tilt worth mentioning, no seasons, no day-night cycle variation beyond a dim brightening and darkening, and absolutely no interest in making visitors feel welcome. But it had rare mineral deposits in its crust, and several plant species that produced compounds the pharmaceutical guilds very much wanted to study. So naturally, the Corps was sending people. The expedition team assembled in the landing bay of the survey ship Methodical Inquiry, which was the kind of name that made humans snicker, but everyone else thought was perfectly reasonable. Commander Thexvar, a Vrin whose crystalline carapace caught the overhead lights in professional rainbow refractions, reviewed the roster with the satisfaction of someone who'd successfully delegated all the actual danger to subordinates. "Senior researcher Kilvan Saw," he announced, nodding to the Cathari, whose moist green skin glistened under the bay lights. "Xenobotany specialist. 17 successful expeditions." Kilvan Saw inclined their broad head, throat sac pulsing with humble pride. "Navigator Prex," the ex-VAR continued. "Zelthi survival expert. 12 expeditions. Impeccable record. Prex chittered acknowledgement, their 4 arms checking equipment with mechanical precision. The Zelthi looked like someone had given a praying mantis anxiety and a navigation degree, which wasn't far from the truth. Security Officer Bontra, the ex-VAR said, gesturing to the towering Korvax, whose scaled hide had seen better days and several worse planets. 23 expeditions. Decorated. Bontra grunted, which in Korvax communication ranged anywhere from yes to I could eat you depending on context. This one seemed affirmative. And our human liaison, the ex-VAR added, tone shifting to something between diplomatic and apologetic, as required by the new interspecies cooperation protocols. The human stepped forward. Average height by human standards, which meant short by everyone else's. Wore the Corps uniform like someone who'd read the manual but hadn't internalized the spirit of professional presentation. Hair pulled back practically. Expression that suggested they were paying attention to something nobody else had noticed yet. Liaison Cade Reeves, the human said, offering a hand that nobody shook because 3 of the 4 species present found the gesture somewhere between baffling and unsanitary. Thanks for having me. The ex-VAR's translation implant rendered the human's tone as pleasant but missed the subtle undercurrent that humans called sarcasm. That would become relevant later. The protocols required a human on every major expedition now, part of the diplomatic integration process. Most crews treated their human attachments like mascots, harmless, occasionally entertaining, generally kept away from anything important. This crew's working assumption was no different. The mission is straightforward. The ex-VAR explained, pulling up a holographic display of Vadara 7 that spun with aesthetic menace. 30-day survey expedition. Catalog specimens, analyze soil composition, establish baseline ecosystem data. Our equipment is rated for Class 4 hostile environments. Our psychological profiles ensure team cohesion. Standard protocol throughout. He didn't mention that Class 4 was mainly concerned with things that wanted to eat you, not things that wanted to erase your sense of purpose through sheer, unrelenting sameness. That distinction would also become relevant. Questions. The ex-VAR asked in the tone of someone who didn't actually want any. The human raised a hand. What's the contingency if equipment fails? Equipment doesn't fail. Prex chittered with the confidence of someone whose entire worldview depended on reliable technology. Triple redundancies. Quantum-locked power cells. Atmospheric shielding. Right, the human said. But if it did, it won't, the ex-VAR said firmly. And that was the end of that discussion. They loaded into the drop shuttle with the organized efficiency of experienced researchers who'd done this dance before. Kilvan Saw carefully secured their botanical analysis equipment. Prex ran through pre-flight calculations with the intensity of someone who believed the universe operated on mathematical principles and would be personally offended if it didn't. Bontra checked weapons that probably wouldn't be necessary, but might be very necessary, which was the entire philosophy of security work distilled into equipment selection. The human loaded a single pack that seemed conspicuously small compared to everyone else's gear. When Prex pointed this out, the human just shrugged and said something about traveling light. The translator rendered it as sensible adaptation, missing the subtext entirely. Vadara 7 grew in the viewport from a green marble to a green wall to an overwhelming presence of green that seemed to have opinions about their arrival, none of them welcoming. The shuttle descended through clouds that weren't really clouds so much as atmospheric moisture having an identity crisis. Everything was wet. Everything had always been wet. Everything would remain wet until heat death consumed the universe and possibly after. They landed in a clearing that the preliminary scans had identified as relatively stable, which was surveyor speak for probably won't kill you immediately. The shuttle ramp descended into air so thick with humidity it was less breathing and more drowning vertically. Atmospheric readings nominal, Prex reported, which meant the air wouldn't poison them, just make them wish it would. They stepped into the jungle, and the jungle looked back. It wasn't dramatic. There were no creature roars, no immediate dangers, no obvious threats, just green. Endless, oppressive, monotonous green in every direction, with vines and leaves and trunks and fronds all blurring into an undifferentiated mass of vegetation that stretched to the horizon, and presumably beyond, because Vadara 7 wasn't the kind of planet that did things by halves. The light was wrong, not dark, not bright, just wrong, filtered through so many layers of canopy that it arrived at ground level, exhausted and greenish, and deeply apologetic about the whole situation. Sound was wrong too, simultaneously muffled and amplified in ways that made echolocation useless and normal conversation feel like shouting in a library. Establish base camp, the XVAR ordered. Standard perimeter. We begin surveys at first light. The human didn't mention that first light looked exactly like current light and would look exactly like last light, because Vadara 7's day cycle was less a cycle and more a continuous state of being that time had forgotten about. But the human noticed, filed it away in whatever part of human brains stored information labeled, "This will matter later." They erected the habitat modules with practiced efficiency, force field perimeter established, equipment stations organized, everything according to protocol, which was comforting in the way that a security blanket is comforting, more psychological than practical, but nobody wanted to admit that. Day 1 was fine. Everyone was fresh, motivated, focused. Kilvan Saw collected specimens with scientific enthusiasm. Prex mapped terrain with navigational precision. Bon Tra maintained perimeter security with the vigilance of someone who expected the jungle to try something. The human helped where needed, stayed quiet otherwise, seemed generally unremarkable. Day 3 was less fine. The equipment started developing quirks. Nothing catastrophic, just annoying. Scanners misreading by small margins. Communicators developing static. Power cells draining slightly faster than specifications suggested. The kind of small technical failures that multiplied into large logistical headaches. Atmospheric interference, Prex explained, making adjustments that would stop working within hours. Unexpected mineral content affecting sensors, within tolerances. Within tolerances was doing heavy lifting in that sentence. Day 7 was when the sameness started pressing against their skulls. Every direction looked identical. Every tree could have been the same tree. Every vine could have been the same vine. They were making progress. The maps proved it, the sample logs confirmed it, but it didn't feel like progress. It felt like walking on a treadmill in a green room with the walls slowly closing in. Kilvan Saw's reports became shorter. Prex's calculations took longer. Bon Tra checked the perimeter more frequently, as if expecting the jungle to suddenly do something different. Anything different, please, for the love of all that's coherent, just something to break the monotony. The human kept doing whatever the human was doing, which nobody paid attention to because humans ranked 6.2 on the endurance scale and were presumably handling this worse than everyone else, just quietly. Day 12 was when Thexvar stopped emerging from his module until midday, which wasn't really midday because time had become a polite fiction they all agreed to maintain. His reports to the ship became terse. The crystalline structure of his carapace seemed duller, as if the jungle's relentless sameness was sanding down his shine. Day 15 was when Kilvan Saw missed a specimen collection entirely, just sat by their station staring at nothing, throat sac pulsing irregularly. When Prex asked if they were well, Kilvan Saw said, "What's the point?" in a tone that suggested genuine philosophical inquiry rather than rhetorical frustration. That's when everyone quietly realized they were in trouble. The jungle hadn't attacked them, hadn't needed to. It was simply being itself, infinite, unchanging, utterly indifferent to their presence, and that indifference was dissolving their sense of purpose like sugar in that omnipresent humid air. Prex started recalculating the same routes obsessively, as if the numbers might reveal some hidden pattern that would make the jungle make sense. Bontray's security checks became rituals divorced from actual security concerns, just movement for movement's sake. Thexvar's command decisions took hours because making decisions required believing decisions mattered. They were 18 days in when the humans started changing things. Nobody noticed at first. The human just walked out past the perimeter with a machete, an actual primitive blade of sharpened metal that had made Bontray laugh when they'd seen it in the human's gear, and started cutting. Not randomly, deliberately, cutting a path through the undergrowth in a straight line toward the water source they'd identified in week 1, but had been accessing through whatever route seemed shortest each day, which meant a different route every time because nothing looked the same. The human cut for 3 hours, came back, said nothing about it. Next day did it again, extended the path further, cleared the sides wider, removed obstacles, built something that looked suspiciously like a trail. "What are you doing?" Prex asked, mostly because the repetitive motion was the most interesting thing that had happened in days. "Making a path," the human said, like it was obvious. "Water's that way. We go there every day. Might as well make it easy." "We have navigation equipment," Prex pointed out. "Sure," the human agreed. "But paths are nice." It was such a simple statement that it didn't register as significant. But the next morning, when Kilvan Saw went to collect water, they used the path. Because it was there. Because it was easier. Because following a visible trail their eyes could see was somehow more satisfying than following a navigation readout their brain had to interpret. The human kept cutting. Made more paths. One to the specimen collection site. One to the mineral survey location. One to the clearing where the most interesting plant species grew. Each path straight, cleared, maintained. Each path turning a journey through sameness into a route with purpose. Then the human built a fire. They didn't need fire. The habitat modules provided heat, light, cooking facilities, everything a modern expedition required. Fire was obsolete, primitive, inefficient, but the human gathered deadfall, and there was plenty because Vadara 7's jungle shed organic matter constantly and arranged it in a clear area and coaxed flame into existence with a friction starter that belonged in a museum. The fire burned. It crackled, which was a sound none of them had heard since landing because the jungle didn't crackle. It just hummed with wet biological persistence. It gave off light that wasn't filtered through leaves, wasn't greenish, wasn't apologetic. It created a circle of space that felt different from the rest of the jungle, which violated Vadara 7's core principle of everything being exactly the same. Fire hazard, Bontra, observed without conviction. Controlled burn, the human countered. Everything's too wet to spread. I checked. The Kexvar emerged from his module, drawn by the light, stared at the fire like it was displaying classified information. "Why?" he asked. The human shrugged. "Nights get dark. Fire's nice. Figured we could use nice. They gathered around it that evening, without discussing it, pulled by some instinct older than their civilizations. The fire didn't care about their psychological endurance ratings, didn't care about their advanced degrees or their sophisticated equipment. It just burned, and in burning, created a center point in a world that had none. The humans started adding rituals. Announced morning with "all right, let's see what the jungle's got today," delivered with precisely calibrated sarcasm that the translator couldn't quite capture, but everyone somehow understood. Maintained the fire at the same time each evening, kept the paths clear of new growth, created structure where none existed. Morning walk, the human would say, heading out on path maintenance. An invitation anyone could join. Kilvan Saw started joining. The repetitive motion of clearing, the visible progress of an maintained trail, the simple satisfaction of making something better than it was. It reached something in their Cathari brain that sophisticated analysis hadn't touched in days. Prex started joining the evening fires, calculating optimal fuel ratios with the kind of focus they'd lost on their actual work. Gave them a problem with a visible solution, which was apparently what their Zelthi mind needed. Bontra started maintaining the paths without being asked, incorporating it into security rounds, created a patrol route that felt like protecting something rather than watching for nothing. The Kexvar emerged earlier each day, crystalline structure regaining its shine. Started leading the morning surveys again with something resembling enthusiasm. The fire gave them a place to return to. The paths gave them routes that felt like going somewhere. The routine gave them purpose that transcended sample collection. They completed the mission parameters by day 27, 3 days ahead of schedule. The difference between week 3 and week 4 wasn't better equipment or superior training or psychological endurance ratings. It was trails instead of trackless green, fire instead of filtered light, morning announcements instead of structureless time. It was civilization, rendered at its most basic, built by the species everyone assumed needed civilization, pre-packaged and delivered, because they rated 6.2 on a scale someone had made up after watching a Vryn lose an argument with foliage. On the shuttle ride back, the Kexvar filed his report. Detailed the mission success, the specimens collected, the data gathered, paused at the section about team cohesion and contributing factors. The paths helped, he said carefully. The human reading something on a personal display didn't look up. Paths usually do. We have navigation equipment, the Kexvar pointed out, echoing Prex's earlier observation. Sophisticated mapping systems. Why did the paths matter? The human considered this like it was a genuine question rather than rhetorical confusion. Because you could see them, they said finally. Your brain's really good at following trails it can see. Makes it feel like you're going somewhere. Like there's a reason for going. Technology's great, but it's all abstract. Numbers on screens. Paths are real. You can touch them, walk on them, maintain them. Gives you something to do that matters in ways you can see. And the fire? Kilvan Saw asked. We had light sources, heating elements. Yeah, the human agreed. But fire's fire. It's a center point, gathering place, changes the space around it, makes a spot different from everywhere else, which matters when everywhere else is the same. Plus, it's pretty. You underestimate pretty. These are primitive technologies. Prex chittered, though without judgment now. Genuine curiosity. Primitive's a weird word, the human said. Implies worse. But sometimes simple just means it works at a level your brain evolved to understand. You can jumpstart a heart with electricity, But that doesn't mean the heart stops responding to rhythm. Your species conquered your worlds, but you did it over thousands of years, built up from trails and fires and gathering places. That's still in there, under all the sophistication. Just needed reminding. Bontra rumbled something that the translator rendered as thoughtful agreement. Humans evolved on a planet like that. Bit less humid, the human said. But yeah, lots of jungle, lots of green, lots of same. We got good at making it not same. Trails, camps, landmarks, structure we could see and touch and maintain. Kept us sane when nothing made sense. Your psychological endurance rating is 6.2. The Gexvar said, not accusation, just stating fact that suddenly seemed suspect. The human smiled, expression that the translator labeled amused, but missed the layers underneath. Yeah, well, rating measures how long you can endure structure being absent. Assumes you'll just sit there taking it. Doesn't account for building your own structure when the provided one stops working. That's the neat thing about being adaptable. Environment doesn't meet your needs. Change the environment. They docked with the methodical inquiry, and the expedition team disembarked with their samples and data, and a story they'd tell at symposiums that nobody would quite believe, about a jungle that broke them, and a human who built paths through it. Not because humans were stronger or tougher or rated higher on any scale, but because humans had spent their evolutionary history making homes in places that didn't want them, and had gotten extremely good at it. The Galactic Survey Corps would eventually revise their psychological endurance ratings, added new categories, adaptive structure building, environmental modification instinct, and a footnote that said in essence, some species don't endure hostile environments, they domesticate them, and maybe that counts for something. But that was later. For now, the human filed their liaison report, which was brief and factual, and mentioned nothing about the philosophical implications of trails and fires and morning routines. Just noted that the mission succeeded and that team cohesion was maintained through adaptive strategy implementation. Then went to find the next expedition heading somewhere uncomfortable, because apparently that's where humans were useful, and it was nice to be useful, even if the rating system didn't know how to measure it yet. Somewhere in the galactic core the saying remained, any species that masters faster-than-light travel has already conquered their own world. But nobody bothered adding the corollary, though maybe they should have. And some species learned to conquer worlds without ever really leaving the trails behind. The difference, as it turned out, was everything. 3 months later, Expedition 52 Mordanta faced similar problems on a tundra world where everything was white instead of green, cold instead of humid, but equally soul-crushing in its sameness. Their human liaison built windbreaks from ice blocks and established meal times synchronized to their circadian rhythms rather than the planet's 40-hour rotation. The expedition completed early. Nobody questioned why anymore. Expedition 61 Thesara brought back stories of a human who'd organized singing sessions around their evening fire on a desert world, claimed it helped with morale. The Vrin commander admitted in his report that he'd participated and found the repetitive melodic patterns surprisingly stabilizing, though he'd never tell anyone at headquarters because it sounded ridiculous in writing. The pattern repeated, humans building structures that shouldn't matter but did, creating ritual where there was routine, transforming endurance into something that looked suspiciously like thriving. The Survey Corps started requesting humans for every extended expedition into hostile environments, not because the regulations required it anymore, but because mission success rates had jumped 17% since they'd started actually listening to the species rated 6.2. The HFY eventually wrote a paper titled Adaptive Environmental Modification as Psychological Defense Mechanism. It was dry, academic, cited properly, and completely missed the point while accidentally proving it. The paper noted that humans didn't wait for their environment to break them. They broke it first, gently, into manageable pieces connected by paths they could walk. The conclusion suggested that perhaps psychological endurance wasn't about withstanding pressure until you shattered, but about building pressure valves before the shattering started. Revolutionary thinking, if you ignored the fact that humans had been doing exactly that since their ancestors first cleared a trail through their own planetary jungles and thought, that's better. Sometimes the most advanced solution was remembering what worked when nothing else existed. The galaxy was slowly learning this lesson, one path at a time, guided by the species that never forgot it.